Hello, on behalf of the Brunswick Group, thank you for joining us here today. My name is Jonathan Burks, and I am the co-lead of the U.S. Public Affairs practice for the Brunswick. We are a firm that sits at the intersection of business and government, and we work to help firms deal with their most difficult problems. Arguably, there is no industry with more interesting challenges at that government-business intersection than the tech sector, which is why we closely monitor the trends in technology, public opinion, and public policy. And I think today's event will be a fascinating examination of the current state of play, bringing together Brunswick's unique ability to measure public sentiment, engage policymakers across the spectrum and around the world, and ultimately to draw penetrating insights that help our clients navigate the shifting landscape. One thing that differentiates Brunswick is our international scope. Every day, we work with partners across the globe on these issues, and today is no different. So with that, let me turn it to my colleague in Brussels, Nick Blow.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for making the time to join us this afternoon. I just wanted to quickly give you a bit of background to this project. Back in the summer of 2018, we all started to read the headlines about the Techlash and the backlash against technology companies in both the US and in Europe. And we started to, with clients and also with many of the other people and stakeholders who are on the webinar today, who have joined us and are on the panel, we started to think about what exactly that meant. Was this a purely media-led backlash? Was it regulator-led? Was it purely politics? And actually, when you start to think about it, what did actually the consumers really think? Because it was felt across the spectrum of stakeholders that unless it was actually the consumer who demanded change and who demanded change from the major tech businesses, that this wouldn't actually happen. And in fact, as it is now, people continue to buy and services and products and clamour for those, and that was the situation that we were facing. So we went into the field in 2018 for the first time, and we were really in the US and the EU, and we were really not expecting the results that we got. I won't go into them in too much detail. Some of you will have seen them, and they're very much mirrored in today's results as well. We went back in 2019. Again, to ask the same questions to see if there'd been any change in public perception from the side of the consumer, and there hadn't been really. So we were planning this coming fall, and we are going to actually go back into the field and widen our research from the US, Europe, but also bring into it Asia, because we think it's very important to see what the situation is in that geography as well. But then COVID came along, and so there was a lot of debate amongst ourselves in the offices at Brunswick, with all of our interlocutors, with you out there, out there in the field, about whether COVID was actually changing things. In fact, I wish I was a betting man, because I should have actually had a bet on the results of today, and with one of my colleagues in DC. But that's another story. But so we decided to go out to the field early with a smaller sample for Europe than we would usually do, a smaller number of member states, but with the US as well, and to see what difference, the response to COVID and the usefulness, the way that tech has saved many of us in our home offices, to see what sort of impact that has had. I mean, we've all been reading over the last few months about an acceleration of three years. That in e-commerce, in working from home, in using technology like we are now today, we've accelerated in the space of months of what would have taken 3 years. So without further ado, we're going to present to you our research. Claire and Emily are going to actually do this. Claire, some of you will know from her time in Brussels, she's now on a long-term secondment to our San Francisco office, and Emily is on the return on a secondment from Washington, DC to Brussels. They've been very much the brains behind the project. They're the ones who've run the research on each occasion. So I'm going to hand over to them so they can present the research to you.
Thank you, Nick. That's right. This is a sort of an exceptional wave of our research, but we're really excited to be talking with you all today about our results and what we learned. I can't see the slide deck, but I'm assuming it is about to, there it is. So a quick note on methodology. Nick pretty much covered it. This is our third wave. This sample is from 1,100 US consumers throughout the US and 1,500 European consumers across 6 different member states. This was collected online over a 2-week period in May, just about 4 weeks ago. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to kick off with just an overview of US and European perceptions before handing it to Claire, who will talk a little bit about respondent appetite for regulation. So first and foremost, what you'll see on slide 3 is that consumers applaud the tech sector's response to the pandemic. Of all the sectors we tested, many more than what's even on this slide, from corporate to government, tech companies came second only to healthcare as having responded well to the outbreak. Consumers feel they did better than both state level and federal level government bodies by as much as 20 points. Having looked at this data as well by a political ideology, we know that the sentiment also cuts across the political spectrum. So COVID has undoubtedly allowed tech to build a little bit of goodwill. You'll see on slide 4 that the majority of respondents agree that technology companies have actually used their size and their influence for good in the fight against COVID. This goodwill is largely driven by the role tech has been able to play in the lives, in people's lives during lockdown. We tested sort of an array of options, and over 70% of respondents in both the US and Europe agree that tech companies have made stay-at-home orders easier. They've been vital for enabling remote working, they're job creators that aid the economy, and that they're in fact essential to fighting the pandemic. In fact, on slide 5, you'll see that about half of respondents, a little bit more in the US, a little less in Europe, said that they actually have a more favorable view of technology companies since the beginning of COVID. Interestingly, but probably not surprisingly, this favorability goes up actually by about 20 points in both geographies among respondents who've either been diagnosed personally or have had a family member diagnosed with COVID-19. Again, really emphasizing this very personal and day-to-day impact that tech has had on people's lives over the past 3 months. Even further to that point, we saw this data, within the data that this favorability is significantly stronger among employed respondents as opposed to unemployed respondents. Again, indicating that it's really the products and the services and the way that people actually tangibly interact with what tech companies can offer them, rather than just the companies themselves, that is driving this favorability and building this goodwill. But as you can see on the next slide, while consumers' opinions of tech companies have improved in the immediate COVID response, we didn't seem to see an impact on overall sentiment towards the sector, suggesting that this boost of favorability and goodwill is in fact just that, a boost. It's temporary and probably a COVID bubble, if you will, that has made only a modest impact on the long-term views of technology companies. This is supported by what we saw when we tested this along other industries as well. So, for example, the pharmaceutical industry is one that doesn't typically enjoy the most positive of reputations. Received a 13-point increase in US favorability as the search for a COVID vaccine becomes more and more pressing. Similarly, on the other side, we saw a 15-point drop in US perception of e-commerce companies as concerns around labor disputes and job displacement have grown. So this is really telling us that while COVID is able to have these lasting impacts on some sectors, technology is not one of them, indicating that the goodwill that we've seen and that has been built will likely be short-lived. So with that, I'm going to hand it to my colleague Claire, who will talk a bit about what's to come next.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, the other part of our research since 2018 is looking at, in spite of consumers' overall favorable opinions to technology and technology companies, their appetite for tech regulation, both in the US and in the EU. So we've been tracking that appetite since 2018. On the next slide, you'll see that when we ask people for their priorities in terms of government actions, a wide range of possibilities, tech regulation is not high on the agenda for them. It is not one of the priorities that people identify if you give them a wide range of issues, including climate change, immigration, or the economy, for example. This year, which I think is expected by everybody, the COVID-19 outbreak is the absolute priority for consumers, both in the EU and in the US, closely followed by the need to strengthen the economy in both regions. So that has had an impact, obviously, on all other issue areas as well. But when we did this exercise in 2019, regulation of technology companies was also the one to last issue that was selected by consumers. We see a drop of a few points for support for this, for regulation of technologies, for support of regulation of technology companies in both markets. But again, the sort of order of priorities for consumers hasn't really changed. What's interesting is that when we ask directly consumers whether they support more active regulation by governments, not as part of a broader range of policy issues, there is a much higher support for that. However, even among those who do want the government to be more active in regulating the tech sector, tech regulation is not top of mind for them when compared to other policy issues. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that when asked directly that question, there is a very strong level of support for increased regulation of the tech industry, both in Europe and in the EU. We've been tracking this data since 2018, and what's most interesting to me, sitting here in San Francisco, is the big jump in support in the US. So I think when we first did this study, we expected a big difference between US and European consumers on this question, because there's this sort of idea that European consumers are more favorable to government regulation than US consumers are. However, the results were always pretty close, and this year, for the first time, there is higher support for tech regulation in the US than there is in the EU. When we look at this jump in support, actually, it cuts across a lot of the demographics that we tested for, both political affiliation, age, where people live in the US. So it's a pretty homogeneous increase in support for tech regulation. In the EU, that support is driven more so by the left and the center than by the right. On the next slide, we asked people to rank a number of tech-related priorities, which included the fight against fake news, or protecting people's data and privacy, protecting children from inappropriate content online, enabling economic growth, and a range of other issues. This year, COVID was for the first time included in this list of issues, and using technology to address the outbreak is the one most important issue facing tech right now. Ranked number one in both of our markets for consumers, more so than privacy, more so than cyber attacks, fake news, or job creation. At the same time, we ask people, for these same issues that you rank as most important to you, who do you trust most to address them? Is it tech companies themselves or your government? In both the US and the EU, we asked the European Commission, or member states and federal government versus state government. And you'll see that consumers are actually less likely to trust tech companies to use their own technology to address the outbreak than they are governments, which to us indicates a vacuum of trust between consumers and tech companies. So even as they see the value of the products and the services, as Emily explained earlier, they don't trust the industries themselves to do the right thing. Next slide, please. We asked specifically the question of whether tech companies should be sharing personal data and personal location data with governments to help address the outbreak. And again, here you see a very split opinion between consumers. And there's this, I think, another sign of this distrust, which indicates that even though the use of technology is recognized as a tool for addressing the outbreak, there is low trust in tech companies doing the right thing with our data. And there's about half of the population in both markets who thinks that the downsides of sharing location data with governments would be higher than the benefits for the outbreak and the economy. And that's even the case for people who have themselves been affected by COVID, either themselves or a member of their household. Only, or about about 60% of people who have been affected think that sharing personal data with governments is a good way to address the outbreak. So it's slightly higher than for the average consumer, but still not very high. So on the next slide, I think another interesting area that we've been exploring since 2018 is the idea of sort of what content is being put on tech platforms and what role they play in disseminating information, whether misinformation or trusted information. Again, I think we've seen, as Emily pointed earlier, that there's goodwill that's been built by companies. And I think there's a recognition of their efforts in acting to combat health misinformation during the outbreak. These numbers are slightly higher than they were when we tested in previous years' questions around the role of tech companies in fighting fake news or disseminating misinformation. So again, we see a slight uptick in positive perceptions, but still limited, particularly in the EU. On the next slide, these are statements that we've been testing for since 2018. And I think what's interesting here is that you see a very small change only this year. So our perspective, again, is that in spite of the goodwill that's been built by tech companies through the products and services that they've been able to offer during the outbreak, it hasn't really affected people's views of the actual underlying policy issues. So for example, support for holding tech companies legally responsible or liable for the content that's being posted on their platforms. So the sort of Section 230 debate in the US and the Digital Services Act in the EU is still very high and very consistent. I will note that this data that we were in the field before President Trump adopted his executive order in the US, so this should not be affected by the latest sort of situation in the US. Similarly, the perceptions that social media platforms have political bias are very stable since last year. The opinions about whether tech companies contribute to the rise of extremism and violence, again, very stable. And then support for breaking up big tech, also very stable. And again, one that's interesting to me is to see that support for breaking up big tech is actually higher in the US than it is in the EU. And from previous data, we know that that support is very, again, evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. It is not a left-wing issue in the US, actually, among consumers, in spite of that policy proposal being really carried by Senator Warren. So on the last slide, we have just sort of conclusions from this research, and we'd love to hear any questions that the audience has about the research. And then we'll hand over to our panel of external speakers to discuss the broader implications of this research for policymaking going forward.
I have a question, actually. This is Javier at the Financial Times. So you talk throughout the presentation about tech companies in general, but can you give us maybe a little bit of a breakdown in terms of the reputation in different sub-segments like e-commerce or social networking or video apps like Zoom? So, yeah.
Yeah, happy to do that. So I think overall, views have been pretty stable across the last 3 years across most segments. So we look at technology companies in general, and we let people define what they understand by technology companies. And that's the sort of highest. When we ask people what they think of technology companies, that's what gives us the highest positive perception. Once we start to break down in sub-segments, more specific segments, views change. I think we saw on one of Emily's slides that social media perceptions, for example, are much lower and hover around 55 to 60% of positive perceptions in the US and about 50% in the EU. So there's a big drop of about 25 or 30 points between technology companies in general and social media. For e-commerce, I think Emily noted that earlier as well, there's been a big drop actually in the US specifically, a drop of 13 points compared to 2019 of positive perceptions. I think that's the technology sector that's been most affected by our COVID research. We looked also at online streaming companies, for example. They received 70% of positive opinions. Interestingly, food delivery companies only receive about 40% of positive opinions, but they have a much higher level of neutral opinions, people maybe not using their service as much and so not really having an opinion. We also ask people their opinions about specific products and services and what they considered most essential during COVID. Americans in general thought that tech products and services were more essential to them during the pandemic than Europeans did. On both sides, I think the most positive product that was named by people is Google. And then we see pretty big differences between Europe and the EU in how they perceive Amazon, for example. It's much more essential in the US than it is in the EU. Zoom, again, much higher rate of being called essential in the US than it is in the EU. And then, again, same for food delivery companies, a much higher perception of how important they are in the US than in the EU.
Excellent. That's very interesting. And maybe one of the first questions to our panelists about what do they consider essential tools during their confinement in the last few months. I see there's no more questions from the floor. So unless you guys have something else to add from your presentation, I can go ahead and introduce our panelists, but
Perfect.
Let me know.
Yeah, thank you, Javier. We'll hand over to the panel.
Thank you so much. So it's a great pleasure to introduce today on this very warm afternoon here in Brussels, and at least Werner Steng, member of the cabinet for Executive Vice President Margaret Vestager, Jason Oxman, President and CEO of ITIC, and Mike Blomquist, Staff Director at the Committee on Energy and Commerce at the House of Representatives in the US. Thank you very much for joining. So just an easy question to start the discussion today. And let's start with Mike. What has been, it was interesting that in this research that we're talking about essential tools. So what would you say has been the app or the application that you've used the most in the last 3 months?
Boy, that's a good one. I had not done much video conferencing before this. The Capitol Hill in the States is more of a open doors and meeting in person kind of place. But I would say it started out with a lot of Zoom, and then the House IT people kind of came up with a whole security protocol. And so we have like 3 or 4 different platforms. So it's WebEx, it's Zoom, it's this is my first time using StreamYard. So, but it feels like it's compressed a lot of teleworking advancements into 4 months. A lot of years of tech are being forced upon us.
There you go. You're not going to want to leave the house anymore.
It feels that way sometimes.
Jason, what about you?
Yeah, Javier, first of all, thanks for bringing us together for this important conversation. It's been interesting, to Mike's point about working remotely. We just surveyed the ITI staff. ITI is a global organization. We have offices in the US, in Brussels, in India, and in South America. And 97% of our staff reported they are either as productive or more productive working remotely than they were in physical offices. Our physical offices have been closed since March 13th. I just announced to the team today that we're going to be closed through early September at the earliest, those physical offices. So I think the most important tool that we have working remotely for my kids learning remotely is broadband access. I think we once upon a time thought of broadband as a luxury in some cases. I think it's very clear now that, like electricity and water, that broadband, to keep us connected, to keep us working remotely, learning remotely, to access our doctors remotely, broadband is really the tool. And one of the things I know we're going to talk about today is how public policymakers are looking at broadband access as a necessity and ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the continued digital divide. That means that some people don't have access to broadband and can't do the kind of things that we need to be able to do remotely. So I vote for broadband as the essential technology tool.
That's a very good point. And even in so-called developed democracies, broadband sometimes is a little bit patchy. to say the least. Werner, what about you? What's been your favorite tool?
Hello, everybody. I could give a lot of intelligent answers now, but at times of crisis, sometimes very simple things matter. The most simple of all is food, probably. Now, especially in the first few weeks, I spent a lot of time finding for food delivery solutions, right? Going through all types of supermarkets that we know so well in Brussels and see who has been capable of delivering food from the distance, because I didn't want to go physically into the supermarket. So that was one thing. And in that, I discovered lots of interesting apps around to connect farmers in the vicinity of Brussels, And all of a sudden, I discovered that there are very intelligent ways of sourcing yourself. But it took a crisis for me, actually, to find out how I can get the best meat and the best vegetables and fruit and all the other stuff from around Brussels. So that was a big learning point for me.
I should ask you for the list after this. That's very good. Okay, so I just want to pick up on some of the points from the presentation. I think easy to say Techlash, I know, has been a phrase that's been around for a long time, but right now the crisis has definitely intensified the kind of, it's in vogue, I want to say, more than it was, prior to the crisis. Definitely. And Werner, maybe we start with you. And, from some of the responses from this survey, it indicates that people actually are quite happy with the way that technology companies responded to the crisis. They were very proactive. Twitter and Google quickly started highlighting sources of information that were of good reputation. Facebook took down disinformation posts pretty quickly. Amazon also has, even now, a counterfeit crime unit. They are doing a fantastic job. So therefore, no need to regulate them anymore. What's the point?
Let me start with the term Techlash. It sounds like something very modern now. Let's now be anti-tech or something. I think that we're having these discussions at all, whether it's amongst regulators or amongst citizens, consumers, is that tech has become so important in our lives. I mean, that's a matter of fact that 10 years ago, we did not talk about the platforms all the time, simply because they did not occupy such an important place in our economies, in our lives, in our communication pattern, how we shop, to this, that, and the other. They had not been those gatekeepers to markets, to services, to goods, to information, to content than they are today. So if we're having this debate, that's just a reflection of this, of the increasing importance of tech in our lives. Second, when we talk about also in the presentation about tech regulation, first of all, I agree with Javier's your own question, sort of what is tech actually, because tech can mean many different things, and we've already discussed the difference between an app store and an e-commerce marketplace and then Facebook, and also tech regulation. If you ask people out there, would you want more tech regulation or less because of COVID? That's a question nobody can answer seriously, if you ask me. I've been working in this for 10 years now on digital matters. Tech regulation can mean many, many things. So obviously people were happy with tech in times of crisis because that was the only thing that still worked. So of course you are happy that you can shop and that you can get your children some education still, that you can work from home. Oh, I don't know, but I was happy that I was able to work, but it doesn't matter. But in that sense, yeah, it's a very natural reaction of people to say, yeah, it was fine. But that does not mean that all the issues, and we can come back to that, that we or people may associate with tech, what are the downsides, what are the risks and so on, they have not disappeared just because I was able to shop locally from farmers near Brussels.
That's a good point. Mike, what's the view from the Hill, so to speak?
I mean, I thought the presentation at the high level was very reflective of my own experience and from what I hear of members of Congress that, could we imagine being in this situation 20 years ago? It'd be so much more difficult. But the underlying concerns are still there. I think one aspect of the those high percentages of the populations in the US and the EU that have a desire to regulate tech, I think when you then go, well, what do you want to regulate? It could either be online, misrepresentation, faulty PPE, or fake charities, and people are that always provokes a reaction. You have issues like online trafficking, people worried about oh, tech's doing great, they're going to help us solve the problem, but then Apple and Google bring up their effort to help with contact tracing, and boy, that got people nervous right away. So I think they're very difficult issues. Even when you try to address the digital divide, is it building out broadband? Is it providing hotspots to families? What's the proper role of government versus the private sector? These are very difficult issues, and I think the desire to regulate, they're almost subsets of different groups that are motivated to regulate in different ways and would all say yes, we should regulate, but how they want to actually do it differs.
Excellent. And Jason, I guess the bad news for you is that we talk in this presentation about this COVID bubble. So the goodwill from people towards the tech industry basically lasted a few months. So now you're back in the spotlight.
Well, it's an interesting way of thinking about it. I prefer, of course, to say that the goodwill that we've seen during COVID-19 is a reflection of the fact that consumers have more direct experience with these technology products and services, using it for things like accessing food delivery, which many people hadn't used before, or using it for purposes of distance learning, which many kids didn't have experience with until we all started learning from home, using cloud services and remote broadband access and VPNs to work from home, which a lot of people didn't have experience with. So the way I look at the survey results is not so much as a bubble, but a reflection of the fact that when consumers actually have experience using these great technology products and services, they feel better about them. I think there's a certain abstraction, and Mike alluded to this in looking at the survey results, and that is when you ask consumers, do you want to regulate the technology industry? Reflexively, some of them say yes. And one of the reasons for that is they hear about it a lot. They hear people, ranging from the president of the United States talking about how we need to criticize and regulate tech industries, or leaders in Europe talking about how some tech companies are too big and we need to regulate them. But when you start to drill down and ask consumers, well, what does that mean? What actually do you want that regulation to address? What are you concerned about? That's where the abstractions kind of don't translate into concrete recommendations for policies. And again, I think it's because consumers have that positive experience with technology. Now, that's not to say there aren't issues that the industry needs to address. And I know we'll talk about things like trust, because that came up in the survey, consumer level of trust of technology companies. With some work to do there, no question about it. But I would push back, Javier, and say that this is not so much a bubble caused by COVID-19. It's actually a reflection of consumer use of technology, their dependence on it, their positive experiences with it that causes them to feel better about the tech sector when they're actually having that one-on-one relationship with tech products.
Excellent. And to speak of technology, and Werner dropped off, but now has reemerged. Very good. Okay, so Jason, you were talking about this issue of trust, which is again another theme throughout the findings, and I just want to hear maybe from Mike's perspective, from the point of view of regulators and politicians, and in the U.S., what is the sense of trust when it comes to tech companies?
I mean, I would say for members, there's somewhat of a West Coast, East Coast split when it comes to how much rope and trust they're going to give companies that are, the companies are very much like, we're bringing you these miracles, and all you need to do is say, I agree, and click through. And then there's some members that are a little concerned that everybody's just saying, I accept, and they aren't really thinking about what that means. And so and then you hear some horrible story of a data breach or some use of information. But it's tough because, a company like Apple, they try to use encryption as a way to build trust with their customers. And then you get everybody, on the Republican side, the more conservative side, worried that this is going to lead to a terrorist incident or criminals going free, and so it's a very difficult to find the right footing to build trust and make everybody happy.
What about people's trust, beyond just the political circles? What's your sense of Americans today? I mean, we know where the president stands in relation to...
I mean, I think people are worried about, we had a hearing yesterday on online misrepresentation. I would say the Democrats were pounding on Twitter because pounding on Facebook because they feel like it doesn't do enough to regulate its content and police its the postings. And then the Republicans were mad at Twitter because they feel like it's using too much editorial discretion. I mean, partially I view it, my kids, and I see them voting with their feet and clicking right through and, engage using these last 4 months. They've been putting in a lot of screen time. And so it's, that's probably more reflective of where people actually come down.
Excellent. Now, Werner, from my conversations with people here in Brussels, there seems to be quite a high level of mistrust when it comes to tech companies, right? I mean, just to give an example, for instance, Facebook bought WhatsApp all those years ago, and then they ended up being fined by the commission because they misrepresented their intentions when it came to data, for instance. So I wonder if you can give us a little bit of an insight from, inside the machine. How mistrustful are we on these platforms?
Probably two attempts to answer your question. The first is starting from sort of the consumer, the user of the internet, does he/she trust or not? Sometimes probably the user wouldn't even know whether he should trust or should not trust. Because if you, for instance, you're using some nice services that provide you with all you need in a way, you may be happy, but you don't know that you may be deprived of something even better, right? Let's call it lock-in effect, to use the jargon, where we policymakers would be saying, there's a risk for consumers if they are locked in some solutions because they may not get something better. And if not now, probably in 5 years, they could have gotten something better, but in the meantime, competitors disappear. That is something, of course, that never enters probably the normal consumer's mind. Yeah, you consume something, you like it or you don't like it. That's one dimension that sometimes we need to take one step out of that bubble and think more objectively what trust issues or what general issues are there. The second attempt is a more general one. And that comes from the fact that I mentioned the term gatekeeper before. What that actually means is that we have now some matchmakers out there, which didn't exist when I was a student, probably the internet did not exist, but later when we already had search, but there were no platforms, I used the search engine and then I got, thousands of possible answers. Was of course completely not digestible, but still, I was lost, I was not lost. Now I have someone who makes that for me, that brings together supply and demand in whatever form and presents the results to me. Using, of course, something I don't understand and will never understand, algorithms and AI and what have you, based on enormous data, which I also don't understand nor see. So if you offer me now something, Javier, you tell me, if you want to go to this country, use hotels 1, 2, or 3. If you tell me that from your home country, I would probably go there because I trust you, I know you, and so on. But if a machine gives me this result, why would I naturally trust that this is the best thing for me? That would only work if the interests are totally aligned, right? If I think that's my friend, you may be my friend, but is any other platform my friend, or are they trying to make money? Which is, of course, what they do. And that's not a bad thing, right? It's a profit motive. Yet they have these sort of gatekeeper functions and present something to me. Why the hell should I trust that they only have my interest in mind? Day and night, they can't fall asleep if they're not sure that Werner is happy. Probably they would be much unhappier still if ad income was reduced. So it's very much an alignment of interest thing.
Jason, this is very to the point of trust. How do you address this as an industry? You know?
Well, it's actually not that I want to discuss economics with an economist, but I think to Werner's point, actually, we're pretty evenly split here. Javier, you're an economist too, and Mike and I are just boring liberal arts guys with law degrees. But it's a competition matter, and any, whether it's commerce, let's talk about e-commerce because I think that's most relevant here. If you have a poor experience with your e-commerce provider, you're going to go somewhere else. And although we talk a lot about the success of e-commerce in the US, for example, e-commerce today represents about 15% of overall commerce. 85% of transactions still take place at a brick and mortar retailer. Now, of course, those brick and mortar retailers are moving online as well, so the numbers are going up. In Europe, it's even lower for e-commerce percentage. So consumers vote with their wallets. If they have a poor experience, they're not going to use that provider. Same thing in travel. To Werner's example, if I get a recommendation for a hotel online and I don't have a good experience there, I'm not going to use that travel site anymore. I'm going to go to a different one. So I think the competitive issues will drive a response from tech companies, and that is that these companies, in order to maintain and grow their customer base, will make sure that they maintain and restore the trust of their customers.
Very good. And I think you talk about e-commerce, and I think it's a good way to introduce some of the things that we saw throughout the pandemic and hear the perspective from regulators. So for instance, we had a question here about, fake masks and fake hand sanitizers being sold online. And I wonder, Werner, I see you nodding, so I think you have really good ideas. How do we tackle this? In a way, it's an old phenomenon, but it manifested in a new situation. So can you give us a little bit of the insight of how the EU is thinking about this?
Of course, because that's another trust issue, if you want. It's not so much trust whether I get the right search results, or trust whether I get the right information or disinformation. That's the trust whether the stuff that I buy online may potentially kill me or be fake or may be ripped off. And that is something, again, where people's minds probably change very slowly. We all grew up in systems that were probably heavily regulated, right? If we went to any department store, we could be pretty sure that there was nothing on the shelves that would be illegal. Why would it, in a way? And I think people have this still in their mind. If there's some legal shopping possibility, that they will somehow be looked after. I mean, probably that's a bit the European perspective of government taking care of you. My US colleagues here may see that differently. But now people are going now online, going on Alibaba, Amazon, or anywhere else, and find some stuff in China. I don't think that all of those people have this sort of reflection, oh, be careful. Can I be sure that this product will be compliant with European safety and product standards? It's probably a bureaucrat's mindset, but not necessarily someone that looks for a product and may not even realize it comes from China. I'm not saying now everything that comes from China is fake and dangerous, but it's just an example, right? But the consumer would not necessarily know that and just think, since it's legal to buy it online, I'm sure the product will be legal as well. Now, that is something we need to look after, because the sheer volumes of stuff that comes into Europe that is being bought by European consumers and does not meet our basic product standards, safety standards, what have you. That's huge, right? So we need to take some measures to not protect consumers to the last, percentage of risk, but to give some reasonable reassurance that there is some checks and balances, some due diligence, that platforms in that sense cannot say, oh, we are just passive hosting service providers, not my business who sells on my platform and who buys, But still, I mean, they are instrumental in getting that stuff on the market. They should not be liable for this, to go into this wonderful discussion of liability, but they should assume greater responsibility in making their contribution, that they don't, these externalities, to use economist jargon, that they integrate some of the externalities and don't say, well, none of my business. I make the money with this, but I don't have to invest in my systems to reduce the number of illegal and illicit activity.
And we'll come back to this liability point and how we strike the balance. But Mike, can we hear from you about this idea of trust and e-commerce and just the sale of this sort of faulty, potentially dangerous, life-threatening products? What's the perspective in the US?
I mean, I think definitely there's been a lot of referral of a lot of bad actors to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. And they have the ability to, from the executive branch, to pursue deceptive trade practices. So there's a certain amount of intent by the electronic commerce provider. But I think, as Jason said, you get a bad set of masks, you're probably going to be pretty mad at the company that facilitated that transaction, and you're never going to want to order from that supplier again. So, you know, it's you get kicked by the mule once, you learn your lesson. But I agree with what Werner's saying, is that I think there is there's an element of corporate responsibility and being a good corporate citizen to ensuring that what you're peddling is safe and effective.
And on this point, Jason, of striking the balance of how reliable platforms should be, where is the discussion? What sort of conversations are you having now with regulators? I'm sure you're intensively pushing to be extremely liable for everything that happens online. No, a joke, by the way, but just give us a little bit of the flavor of what the discussions are.
Well, it is interesting because it applies in the e-commerce area, and it also applies in the content area. And you know, to Mike's point, a lot of this is a law enforcement matter, whether it's the law enforcement officials in Europe or in the US. If you're selling illegal substances, or you're selling counterfeit Gucci bags, or you're selling illegally pirated DVDs, you're a criminal. And so to the extent that we can focus on the bad actors, the people who lie to the customers that buy those products also lie to the platforms that carry those products. It's very clear that it's against e-commerce platform rules to sell illegal goods. And so it's a law enforcement matter. And I would push back a little bit on the notion that e-commerce companies don't have as much interest in law enforcement as going after those criminals, because it is bad for the reputation. It's bad for the brand. It creates a customer service issue. As Mike mentioned, when you get those bad masks, you're not calling somebody in China to complain about it or get your money back. You're calling the e-commerce company you bought the masks from. So everyone shares, with the exception of the criminals, an interest in targeting the problem, which is the sellers of bad goods.
Okay, Jason, I think Werner does not agree entirely with your position, so let's hear it.
I don't entirely disagree, but also don't entirely agree. Two comments probably. Yeah, you're saying it's a law enforcement matter. Wonderful. But part of the problem is that law enforcement has become so difficult in this space, because there's such a disintermediation of the traditional actors in the chain. Previously you imported some stuff, it went through customs, it was inspected 5 times, it was put on the place on the market and what have you, and then they were exposed to inspections. Now the consumer orders directly, that stuff is being shipped directly using the post. As much as I do that, customs probably looks into less than 1% of anything that comes in. Market surveillance authorities are totally helpless. And the consumer, I would challenge both of you on the other side of the screen, that the consumer is so always unhappy and then changes supplier. Often they wouldn't even notice either that they have a fake product or that it's a dangerous one. We have studies that have shown how many products contain chemicals that are not allowed. You're buying some toys for your kid and you put it in the bath tube. As long as this is swimming and the child is happy, you would never notice that you've given something potentially poisonous to your child. So it's not always so obvious that the consumer is then upset and then would buy somewhere else if there is so many choice anyway. Last comment on this, it's also not just a consumer protection or whatever issue, it's also a competition issue. Because what about all the other normal traders, whether they are online or offline, that do comply with existing laws? So since the others can't be caught so easily, I mean, that's really a level playing field that has got nothing to do with protection now of one business model rather than the other. Because I would protect any other online seller as much as an offline seller. If they have to comply with the law, and that affects their price and everything. Why should others get a free ride? So,
Jason, I feel like you should say something back.
I do too, and thank you. Those are all excellent points, and I think here's an interesting example of how I think this actually can and should work. Bayer, the German chemical company, just announced that it's going to enter into an agreement to settle hundreds of lawsuits that have been filed about a weed killer called Roundup for $10 billion because of claims that Roundup causes cancer. Now, those Roundup products, the weed killer, were sold in department stores, in grocery stores, in hardware stores around the world. And in no circumstances the retailer that sold that potentially harmful and poisonous product responsible for it. They didn't deliberately put those items on the shelves in order to give their customers cancer. That's a bad business plan, killing your customers. Yet, liability laid where it should, which was the company that made the product. And I don't think that analysis changes based on whether you're buying something in person, whether you're buying it online, whether you're buying it from a huge multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporation that sells online, or whether you're buying it from a mom and pop hardware store that sells online. I don't think the circumstances change. I don't think the liability should rest in a different place based on that analysis. And then to Werner's second point about large versus small retailers, well, I think that's true in the brick and mortar world as it is online. Some very large big box retailers here in the US, companies like Walmart or Home Depot, compete against small businesses that sell the same products. And big companies often have a price advantage. Where small companies do it well is they do customer service better, or they do locations better, or they do other kinds of personal touches better. That's true online, and it's true in person as well. So, this idea that big is bad, it's not necessarily where I think the debate should be.
Werner.
Sorry, it seems to be we're having a little debate here bilaterally. But on
perfect.
point, I need to come back. I can't leave it like this. I start with the last point. I did not say big versus small is not fair. Let's go after the big ones. I said illegal sales versus legal sales is not fair. Whether those illegal sales are made by big or small, and whether the other ones that are affected are big or small, I did not say a word of. I just said there's a competition issue if some have to comply and do comply with the law and pay the price for that, and others don't. I did not say we have to go after big. The first one, I also did not say I want to change, or we want to change the liability regime. You said liability should be where it belongs. Whoever produced that illegal product should, and I fully agree with that. In reality, the problem is just that those people are sometimes far away and can't be caught. And if market surveillance authorities find that a particular product has come in through a platform by some Chinese seller, and then the platform tries to locate that seller. The seller has disappeared, has never been properly authenticated, identified. 5 minutes later, signs in under different credentials and sells the same stuff again. So it's very hard to get to that trader. So that does not mean that we want to shift the liability now from those third-party sellers to the platform. What we are saying is we want greater responsibility of that platform, not liability, but that they have to have due processes in place that provide reasonable reassurance that their business, will not be abused so easily. It doesn't mean they're liable for each and every mistake.
So, Jason, a reasonable reassurance that whatever I buy online is not going to kill me doesn't sound too dramatic. What's the problem with that?
No, and I think, to Werner's point, it's an excellent point. And again, it fits with our earlier discussion of the need to serve customers and to keep customers healthy and safe. And Javier, you alluded to earlier a new group that Amazon has put together to fight counterfeit goods. That's an example of the private sector stepping up and doing what Werner is looking for the private sector to do, which is take that responsibility. Again, I don't think we have a disagreement about the interests, the economic interests of the seller We know what the economic interests of the criminal enterprise that's producing dangerous or counterfeit or illegal goods is. And we do need to work together and unite to assist law enforcement in doing the very hard work of going after those criminals.
Okay, excellent. I really like the discussion. You know, for our audience, you can see live how, you know, the commission and the big tech are going to go head to head in a fight that will last for months and years.
I'm going to disappoint you there and tell you that we are big fans of the work that Werner does in the cabinet of the executive vice president. And so if you're looking for a fight, it's not going to be with this policymaker.
No, but excellent. No, that's very good. And I have one question there's a lot of questions coming through, which is great. But I just have one more question that touches upon this point of products, safety, and liability, and then we can move on to something else. So I'll just read it. When consumers buy fake products on marketplaces, they blame the brand rather than the marketplace. Also, marketplaces fail to inform consumers who have bought products that have been taken down. I mean, it's really not a question, more like a comment from Benjamin Niet at LVMH. Who wants to take that?
I thought it sounded like a pretty interesting idea, because maybe that's a place where some consumer protection is needed, because it would certainly not, I would think, would be in a company's interest to make sure that their customers received authentic products. But I could see some people maybe deciding that the expense or the risk to reputation is, and as Werner was saying, if the customer doesn't know and they're happy with their fake bag, well, that's great. And so, but I thought that was an interesting idea. If you find out somebody who's sourcing you goods is fraudulent, what should be your responsibility for past sales of those goods as an online retailer? It's an interesting idea. I hadn't. Maybe Jason's heard this before, but I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, you know, Mike, what it made me think of is the battle a number of years ago on the Hill, and one I know you were involved in, about assigning liability to banks and credit card companies and credit card networks for purchases of
the endless war.
Exactly. And I should use, out of respect to the questioner, I should use a different example other than a Gucci bag. I should pick another luxury brand, of which LVMH has many. But I think that's a fair question. And the legislation I'm alluding to was introduced on Capitol Hill and made it pretty far. And it was an effort by manufacturers of luxury goods and the content industry to hold credit card networks and credit cards responsible for purchases of counterfeit goods. And the idea there is, if it weren't for the ability to use a credit card online, then no one would be able to buy counterfeit goods. And I would oppose that kind of idea, oppose that kind of legislation of holding credit card networks responsible, because they don't know whether it's a counterfeit bag any more than you or I might. But again, I think it goes back to the challenge that Werner highlighted about the work that law enforcement has to do here. It's hard to find the criminals. It's hard to hold them responsible. And I think we need to work together as an industry, the tech sector and regulators and law enforcement, to address that challenge head on.
Werner?
Well, I'm not going to venture now into any conclusions what would be a good policy or not, because as you know, here in Europe, we are consulting right now as to what those responsibilities should be, right? We're taking a bit digital business models one by one. We are looking into any potential risks that may be associated with those. And from that, we will then conclude who would be best placed to take action, if you want. Yeah, and that's a bit linked to what Jason said. Does a credit card company know that someone buys counterfeit product when using that card? So this is intrinsically linked, right? Who is in a position actually to intervene? And I hope that we will get something out of the consultation on this. More generally speaking, I'm coming back to points that you made before, Jason, that the consumer would be voting with their feet. I would be happy as a consumer if I didn't even have to do through law what the LVMH colleague said, because I would be very happy if my platform approached me and said, "Listen, Werner, we just realized what you bought 4 weeks ago was fake." Whether or not they're legally obliged to give me that information, I would probably appreciate that a lot. Yeah, and said, "Oh my God, they're great guys. You know, I will buy again." So there's also one of the questions, of course, when do we need a legislative intervention, and when would market forces indeed provide the same or a better result?
Excellent. Very good. And I have a sub-question also on this idea of trust. It's a rather very deep philosophical question, I think. Are issues of trust also a reflection of a degradation of trust in institutions more generally in society? And if yes, who is it to blame? So the question is, like, trust, does it go beyond? It's not just a tech issue. Jason, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. We're in a challenging period of time for society generally. COVID-19 has driven us apart in a number of ways. It has literally driven us apart because we can't have the physical interaction with each other that we used to. But it's also experiencing political divide increases. It's fascinating to me to see a difference, for example, in the United States among those who choose to wear masks in public, driven by political differences. You survey people of different parties and they have different responses to the health response. And I think we're in a politically divisive time around the world for various reasons. And I do think that impacts the trust that people have in networks, because it's about what they hear. And what they hear from many politicians is criticism of individual companies. What they hear from politicians is concerns about content being discriminated against depending on who the speaker is. And maybe that causes people to think, well, I can't trust the sources that I'm seeing. You hear a lot of criticism from politicians around the world about news sources, not the Financial Times. No one would dare impugn the FT. But you hear people, politicians, public figures, with the idea of fake news, that you can't trust what you read. So yes, I think that has a lot to do. I think that has a spillover effect for consumers and impacts them.
That's interesting. You mentioned masks. I mean, just the idea of a virus, right? It has a left-leaning views of a virus and right-wing views of a virus. Werner, what are your thoughts about this idea of mistrust going beyond tech and what it means for, you know, the wider sort of institutions?
Well, I think I don't want to talk too much about the trust in institutions and organizations, but rather the trust in something you don't know and you don't understand. That for me is probably more important, because when I grew up, you know, pre-internet, the trust, people earned my trust, and I was able to verify this again and again, right? I bought something in the shop around the corner, and I knew whether the stuff was good, and if I had a problem, that they were dealing with that problem in a fair way. There was even a face usually behind that. Or even when I was consuming news, I was buying my favorite newspaper, and then I trusted that information in that newspaper was probably better, more reliable than another one. Now people, as I said before, we are exposed to something we simply don't know, we can't verify, we don't understand. We find something online that is managed by someone that is not transparent, probably cannot be transparent because they don't want to know the source code of Google or Amazon, right? So it's something you absolutely do not understand. And then you hear from time to time that there have been problems, that there have been scandals. So you do have this anecdotal evidence that something very bad has happened, you know, and there was Cambridge Analytics, and there was this, and there was that. So you have lost a bit this sort of blind trust that this computer does wonderful things for you. There may be something wrong, but you have no way of figuring out whether that's happening to you. You cannot never verify that. I think that for me is very deep down a trust killer.
Excellent. Mike?
I mean, I think one issue that's interesting here is that these are still relatively new, or a relatively new industry. And I think it takes time to earn trust. And that could actually be, something that distinguishes certain retailers from other retailers, is the ability to, as Werner says, announce that they sold something that was fraudulent, or announce that there was a data breach and here's what we're going to do about it. And I think all these companies are still figuring their way, and the ones that survive, I never expected to discuss trust so much in this call, but I think the ones that survive are going to be the ones that earn the trust of the consumer and the regulators, frankly.
Excellent. Great. We keep getting lots of questions from an audience which we cannot see or hear, which is a pity, and it's kind of weird. But thank you so much to people out there, if you can hear me. One more question. It says, depending on what happens in the elections in the US later this year, do the panelists expect a different approach to the regulation of platforms and tech? So this is what happens after the elections this year. Mike, maybe we start with you. Do we think that there's going to be a fundamental shift?
I don't know if there'll be a shift, but there are some things like a nationwide privacy bill is something we've been working on, and it feels like we're always 90% of the way there, and there's just something, a little bit that keeps us from getting there. And I think if there is a shift, the biggest issue right now is the Republican side in general terms wants one single privacy standard for the nation, and the Democrats would like each state to have the ability to regulate in a stricter manner above a federal baseline.
A federal one, yes.
Correct.
Okay.
And so, whereas we view that as balkanization and 50 different standards, they view that as we're incentivizing companies to do the right thing or allowing states to push companies to do the right thing and have an evolving standard of privacy. I think that's the kind of example of if there's a flip on in the Senate and then the White House, and then the House remains in Democratic control. Okay. I think on those kind of issues, one side's going to win that argument.
So then basically you win it by the numbers, basically by like a reconfiguration of the numbers in the House and the Senate. As easy as that.
Yeah, I mean, it'll still be getting stuff passed into law is always a challenge, or I wouldn't have a job, but it's something where I think there's enough momentum that we should do something on privacy. We should be doing something on AI. We should be doing something like Chinese technology. We haven't even talked about that as being a area that there's a lot of bipartisan agreement that something needs to be done. And I think those are all things if things flip and there's a unified government by any one party, it's always a little easier to move your agenda forward.
Very good. Jason, what do you think about this idea of this federal law that Mike was talking about versus state by state, and also how that might shift before and after?
Yeah, we're strong supporters of federal privacy law along the line.
That's where the tech industry stands. Okay. It's easier, I guess, for your perspective to have one say everywhere.
Well, that's exactly right. And the best example of that is Europe. GDPR took 27 separate country privacy regimes and unified it under one centralized regime that made it very easy for companies to abide by a privacy regulatory regime. And in the US, as Mike alluded to, if you've got 50 separate privacy regimes to abide by and you're a tech company trying to figure out how to deploy a service, it's pretty much impossible. So we are strong supporters of federal privacy law, and we hope it will move forward. It has bipartisan support, as Mike mentioned, but Congress has a lot going on right now, and we're working it and trying to get it to move forward. And we support it strongly as we did with GDPR in Europe. To the broader question of the election consequences, I think one thing that's very interesting is the lack of significant differences between the technology platforms of the major presidential candidates. Both President Trump and Vice President Biden have spoken out very strongly about concerns related to China. They've both expressed concerns about the regulatory regime applicable to platforms. They've both talked about the need for spending on innovation for digital infrastructure. They've both spoken out, and both parties on Capitol Hill have bipartisan consensus on the need to address encryption issues. So I think there's a lot of similarities between the two parties. On tech policy, that's probably not something, much as I might want it to be, that people go into the voting booth thinking about. But I think there's a lot of similarities between the candidates. There's certainly differences as well, but on the priority issues that we're focused on, I don't think we're going to see a lot of change going forward on what we can get done.
Okay, got it. Werner, I know you're in Europe, not in the US, but these things increasingly, both sides of the Atlantic talk to each other, and before they even visited each other. So what do you think about this post-election change in the music when it comes to regulation, tech regulation?
But I'm obviously totally unqualified to answer that question, but I would just confirm what Jason said, is that both sides of the Atlantic, we have so many more things in common than what separates us. So that obvious in terms of tech agenda, we should, and in general terms, in policies, we should be much more aligned than any other part of the world probably, and we should build on those commonalities rather than on the differences. Excuse me. I do see some convergence anyway. And this also came out of the survey, actually, it was presented to us today, that at least the public perception of citizens is not so totally different in the US than it is from Europe. It's not that in Europe everybody is super critical, and in the US everybody said, no, wonderful. I mean, there's pretty much an alignment of what people are concerned about, right? And that is reflected also in your political debates in the US, where you're taking up also lots of the discussions that we are having here, whether it's privacy, whether it's liability, whatever it is, market power, you're talking about the same things. We may not always come exactly to the same conclusions, but we're talking about the same issues. I also feel that Europe is increasingly also seen as not as an unreasonable regulator, an over-regulator, but someone who tries to get to the bottom of things and come up with solutions that may not be completely unreasonable. You mentioned, Jason, GDPR. Yes, indeed. It was not only a law that stressed the importance of privacy, but it was also a step towards legal clarity, to trust, to one single framework where also business can get on with it. Yeah, not every regulation is anti-competitive and anti-innovation. And if we address issues like market power, that's also here to help markets actually do their job. Yeah, so I don't think that this old probably vision of Europe being the over-regulator and US, the land of the free. I don't think that's so true anymore, this dichotomy.
Excellent, very good. There's one last question about this liability point that's very specific, and it's more for our US panelists. It says, in the US, the debate about liability is driven by concerns about political bias and child online abuse. Would a reform to Section 230 on liability to address those concerns also change the liability issue for e-commerce platforms, counterfeit issues? Mike?
Well, on our pre-call, I thought Jason did a good job of describing Section 230. You had like 3 pithy sentences that explaining it, and it's a provision from provision that's contained in a 1996 act. So going back quite a ways, that seeks to protect an online platform from the postings or information that's put on there by a third-party vendor. Did I get at it, Jason?
That's exactly right, Mike. And I think what's interesting about the discussions about Section 230, and look, child sex abuse is a terrible issue, and we are united as industry and government in wanting to do everything we can to stop it. We also want to focus on issues related to counterfeit goods, as we've been talking about. But as Mike said, Section 230 is notable in 2 ways. One, it protects platforms for liability, for things that third parties do. So when the Financial Times runs one of Javier's fantastic articles online and then opens it up for comments, and people post things in the comment section that are, libelous or defamatory, the Financial Times is not responsible for that. The person who posted it is. And the same thing is true for other illegal acts. Section 230 has a very clear carve-out that says otherwise applicable criminal laws that would apply still apply. So the need for changes to Section 230 just isn't there because of that carve-out. So to answer the question that's coming in from the audience about this, we can address, and we should address, and we have to address dangerous things that happen online, but they don't happen online because of Section 230. And Section 230 doesn't currently, as it's constituted, interfere with law enforcement's ability to work on those important issues.
Javier, if I could jump back in.
Of course.
I will say that I think, cover your ears, Jason, I do feel that members have been dancing around the idea of reforming Section 230. I think there's a general feeling that perhaps this came from a different era. We're in the 2020s now, and we do need to maybe think about how to modernize the statute, this provision, so that we can get the benefits and the intent of it, and get this robust, open internet out there, thriving, but that it's not seen as being abused. And what those reasonable common sense steps are, I think that's where obviously the details are, where the devil lies, and that's where a lot more conversations need to be had.
And I'm glad they're taking place on Capitol Hill, Mike. To your point, that is a discussion that's happening in Congress, and what we're concerned about, we see things like the executive order that the president issued about a week ago, going after specific platforms for things that he didn't like. That's not the right way to address these issues. If, as Mike says, these dialogues need to take place, they need to take place on Capitol Hill. And it's good to hear that Congress is interested in these issues and will participate in the discussion.
Very good. Werner, to our American audience, can you just give us a really sort of brief sort of summary? I know you're, well more than an expert on the Digital Services Act, which is Europe's answer to, the rules of the internet and the reform, and just give us just a sense of where we come from and where are we? What's the direction of travel right now when it comes to reforming the internet rules in Europe?
Thank you for this simple question at the end of this conversation. But probably first for the US audience here, you have Section 230. We have something similar in our law, which was called the E-commerce Directive at the time, but it's not the same. Because as Jason said, you have sort of this, you are shielded from liability if it comes from third parties that upload content on your platform. We also have a liability exemption or derogation, but that holds only as long as you as a platform don't have knowledge of the illegality of something. So I'm not directly liable indeed if someone posts some illegal hate speech on my platform. But if someone tells me, Werner, you have something illegal there, I have to remove it. Otherwise, I will become liable. So we have a slightly different system, which also means that ours is a bit more complicated to implement because yours is pretty simple, right? If it's not copyright related and to a certain extent child sexual abuse material, you are not liable, and then someone can take you to court or do whatever they want. Our system sort of is not very clear anymore after 20 years from a platform point of view, what actually it means to have knowledge of illegal content. What does it take to obtain knowledge? As of what point could I risk becoming liable? So there's a lack of legal certainty in our system now that people don't know anymore whether a platform should be active or passive in trying to find illegal content. And so the risk situation is not clear anymore. That's one of the reasons why we are reviewing that law. And of course, also 20 years back, we neither had the large social media platforms. We didn't have the Alibabas and Amazons. We didn't have the app stores. We didn't have the booking.coms. We didn't have all sorts of things. So we had devised a law on digital services on a different planet, if you want. Yeah. So now we have to say, okay, let's take stock of what digital services are being offered to us on a daily basis. And as we discussed before in this conversation, what may be the risks? What is the risk of being exposed to hate speech on Facebook, to child pornographic material on YouTube, to illegal products on Facebook, to whatever, right? So what are the risks? And then, as we discussed before, we are considering what should be the responsibilities as a consequence. What would we expect a diligent operator to do to reduce, to mitigate those risks? That's really in a nutshell what this reform is all about.
Excellent, very good. That was a great explanation. Thank you. So I'm mindful we're getting towards the end of our discussion today, but in keeping with the theme of Techlash, I just thought let's just introduce something that has been very topical in recent weeks and months, and this is this introduction of tracing apps, across Europe and elsewhere. And I wonder what your thoughts are from the regulator perspective or the industry. It seems to me that it's a good example of a cooperation between governments and tech companies, but at the same time exposes issues of deploying this thing, privacy of citizens. It opens a minefield of potential troubles, and to say the least, it's been rather chaotic in some places to deploy it. Jason?
Yeah, it is. It is a really important issue, and it shows the important role that technology plays in helping fight the pandemic. We've seen it, technology play this role in supercomputing being deployed to search for a vaccine, and we've seen it deployed in trying to slow the spread. Contact tracing is all about making sure that people know when they've been exposed. As markets start to open back up, this is going to be particularly important. But as you noted in your question, Javier, this is an area where if consumers don't trust that their information is being protected, they're not going to activate the contact tracing services on their mobile devices, and the services won't be effective. This is a great opportunity for partnership between government and the private sector to make sure it's done right. We've seen some governments try to launch their own contact tracing services in Europe. Some of those have worked better than others. The private sector has worked together, companies like Google and Apple joining together to make sure things work across platforms. But again, it all comes back to trust and making sure consumers know that their most private medical information is not going to be shared. The industry has a strong interest in making that happen, and I think government should too. Government needs to work with industry here to make sure this works correctly.
Werner, how do you see it from your perspective? It's opened up some issues.
Yeah, absolutely. The interesting thing is both of you mentioned, if government and big tech come together, then we can achieve things up to a point, I would say. And that was one of the learnings of this. When we have seen Google and Apple cooperate, a new thing. We have seen member states working together very closely under the coordination of the Commission, because indeed, as you rightly said at the beginning, everybody started experimenting with this, but then pretty soon we came together as Europe and we developed a common toolbox and said, well, these are the principles that everybody should respect. Most of all, privacy, of course, and data minimization and limitation in time, and it should be voluntary and so on. So the very basic principles were agreed with the member states very soon. Then we were sitting together over weeks and weeks with member states, their app developers, to work towards interoperability and say, well, if you guys develop your apps, of course, when we start traveling during the summer season, you don't want to download 4 apps on your path to your holiday destination, but you want interconnectivity. So we worked on the interoperability standards, and we have it, right? But then if with all of this, it then depends on the citizen. Are they willing to sign in? Governments can communicate around this. Big tech can communicate around this. We can give triple reassurance. If the individual consumer citizen doesn't feel there's a real need for this, doesn't feel safe, doesn't fully trust, even if you tell them 5 times, oh, it's data, it's privacy respecting, some people may still think, are they sure? Can I really trust? So at the end of the day, without the consumer, without the citizen, that's not going to fly. So we need to get them on board.
Excellent. Mike?
So the committee where I work, we not only do tech and telecom, and we do energy and environmental, but healthcare is one of the areas. And when the folks that work on the public health issues and the members that are involved in that, I think all appreciate and know how important contact tracing is and the role that technology can play there. But and maybe this is everywhere, but in the States, there's a long tradition of privacy, especially in the healthcare space. There's the one place where there is a separate federal standard for privacy is in healthcare. It's an act that's with an acronym HIPAA, and HIPAA is very restrictive on people's personal health information being distributed. And it was I was a little surprised, but it was almost a visceral reaction when Apple and Google announced their app, that people immediately were concerned about the being monitored, having their health status being out there, that it was floating around in the electronic ether, and it just feels like it will take a lot of education and trust, I think, before it becomes widely used. Now, maybe things are going to get so bad we're going to readily embrace it next week, but there are hurdles, certainly.
Excellent. Very good. I think if there's one word that I take away from this conversation today, and talking about the perception from people when it comes to tech, is trust. We had a mini debate about also the liability that platforms should take when it comes to products and services and content online. And we're really now towards the end of our discussion. If I'll just open up the floor now back to Nick. Thank you so much to my panelists for your time. I really appreciate it, and I had a really great time this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, guys, thank you so much. That was a really excellent discussion, and I've been getting WhatsApps and text messages and iMessages and dings from the Chinese side telling me how enjoyable it was and how we need to do this sort of thing more often. I think, one of the upsides.
Next time in person, Nick, with some
well,
drinks.
You keep trying to get me out for a drink, so maybe soon. But I mean, I think if it wasn't for COVID, we would have never actually got around to doing this at a time that got everybody together. And I won't keep us all from dinner, lunch, and breakfast, because I know poor Claire is still going to have her matcha latte for breakfast in San Francisco. But I think one of the things that come out of this is that there is general agreement across the board, politically, that something from everybody on the panel, that something, things need to be done. But the devil, as Mike said on a number of occasions, and I've heard so often in Brussels, the devil is going to be in the detail. And if I'm going to stick with one of my favourite old English TV programmes, Yes Minister, we've got months, if not years, if not decades of fruitful work ahead of us. So, we'll probably be replaced by the next generation dealing with this very, very soon. But I'd just like to say thank you to all of you again. Thank you to Forum Europe for keeping us all in line and on track. Fantastic organisation. And of course, all of this will continue next week at the Forum Europe DSA conference, which I know has a number of you involved, particularly up there on the screen, are going to be in a similar position next week. So thanks again, and have a great evening, afternoon, and morning, everybody.
Take care.